I want to start by apologizing. I'm going to have to keep to just a few words and have to leave right away. I'm leaving the country literally in a few hours and have endless things to do between, but I didn't want to miss at least stopping by and being here. Edward was an old and cherished friend for many, many years. Marvelous person. It's difficult to put that aside while concentrating, at least for a few sentences, on his focusing on his legacy and, more important, what we can do to carry it forward. As others will elaborate, I'm sure, in substantial detail. And as most of you know, Edward was a very distinguished scholar, one of the rare people who changed the way we look at modern history and at the contemporary world. He was also, at the same time, a dedicated activist, best known for having kept the Palestinian cause alive through many grim and dark years, though in fact that was only one of his concerns and only one of the areas of his contributions as a committed activist. One sometimes hears, oddly, that there's some kind of contradiction there, or that it's a criticism that he engaged his life in both ways. It's a very curious and strange kind of criticism, as if by being a scholar or a carpenter, one somehow decides to drop out of the human species and is barred from being concerned with what happens to the world and with its people. The criticism isn't even worth commenting on, so I won't discuss it. Except for one point, there is a difference between a professor and a carpenter and a janitor. It's not a good thing, it's a terrible thing, but the way the world is organized, the professor happens to have a far greater share of privilege, meaning resources, opportunities, options for choice, and it's a truism that privilege confers responsibility, including responsibility to be a dedicated activist. So if there is a criticism, it's the opposite of the one that's usually given for, again, reasons that ought to be just moral truisms. This range of privilege and opportunity actually has some curious consequences. I've experienced it many times in the last many decades, probably you have too, but there's a very striking correlation, it's pretty hard to miss, between privilege and opportunity on the one hand and feelings of paralysis and hopelessness. Seems the greater the privilege, the greater the freedom, the greater the opportunity, the more people feel hopeless, helpless, translates quickly into apathy. You hear in rich and privileged areas and countries, one hears constantly questions about, what can I do? How can I bring about change? As you move to places here or elsewhere in the world where repression is harsher, opportunities are more narrow, people don't ask, what can I do? They tell you, here's what I'm doing. And I've had so many experiences of that kind, I can't even begin to recount them, but the correlation is very striking and ought to make us think. Actually, there was an interesting illustration of it in this morning's New York Times. It's like you can count on M.I.T. for a sound system that doesn't work. You can count on the New York Times for something to talk about if you have a talk that evening. There was an interesting article on a topic that happens to be of personal concern, just personal interest to me for reasons of personal involvement, namely on the repression of the Kurds in southeastern Turkey, which is one of the great crimes of the 1990s. The article is about how, in a trial in a Turkish court, for the first time, some Kurds are able to get the courage to speak of the massive atrocities carried out in a counterinsurgency campaign that destroyed thousands of villages, laid much of the country waste, drove out probably millions of people. Many of them are rotting in slums in Istanbul and caves in the walls of Diyarbakir and others. I've been there a couple of times recently and seen them. The article said that until now, there has been silence about this in Turkey because people are living in fear of retribution, even death. The latter part is correct. The claim that there is silence is is completely false. Turkish intellectuals are not like Western intellectuals. They are courageous, honest, outspoken. In Turkey, the last time I was there, in fact, I was invited by human rights groups in Diyarbakir, by the National Publishers Association in Istanbul, precisely because they wanted voices from outside to join them in what they do all the time, which is not only to condemn the vicious repression and the draconian laws, but to engage in constant civil disobedience against them regularly, leading writers, publishers, journalists, academics, and others, and in fact face and sometimes suffer severe retribution. So that's very different than anything I know of in the West. In the West, the reporter's comments do apply. There is silence. And his article continues the silence. The silence is over the fact that responsibility for those atrocities lies in Washington and the editorial offices of the New York Times and among people like us. The atrocities took place precisely because, for the same reason that they take place in the occupied territories, because the United States authorizes them, funds them, supports them, with material support, diplomatic support, and ideological support, including silence. It's a crucial aspect of ideological support. And it's not out of fear of repression. There's no death sentences here. There's no death sentences for reporters, and there's no, you're not going to be sent to jail for it. It's just a choice. It's a choice to be submissive to power, to shut up, and not to mention the fact ever in the New York Times, or for that matter anywhere, I don't want to pick on them, to mention the fact that as the atrocities escalated through the 90s, so did U.S. military aid. In fact, it was providing 80% of the arms for the atrocities that are deplored in retrospect in this article. Turkey became the leading recipient of U.S. arms in the world, outside of Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category, as the atrocities peaked. By the time the atrocities had succeeded and the population had been crushed, Turkey relinquished that position in 1999 to Colombia, which has by far the worst human rights record in the hemisphere, and following a familiar pattern as the leading recipient of U.S. arms, increasing rapidly as the atrocities increase, and treated with the same silence as in this case. The people in Turkey are not silent. They're outspoken. They don't ask what we can do. They tell you what they're doing. They ask you to join in it. They ask you particularly to break your own silence. And the same thing applies elsewhere, right to the south of Turkey, for example, and in many other places. But those are choices of silence and cowardice that very typically correspond to privilege. That's an interesting fact and a striking one. And it's particularly dramatic because we know that there's a tremendous amount that we can do. We have a legacy of freedom that didn't come as a gift. It's unique in the world, I think, but it wasn't a gift. It was won by centuries of hard struggle. We can decide to abandon it if we like, or we can try to carry it forward. But those are choices. Those are among the innumerable options that we have available. Actually, you don't have to look very far to see the consequences of doing something. Just look around the room, for example, or take a walk down the halls of M.I.T. I've been here for about 50 years. When I got here, it looked very different. Looked around the room, walked through the halls, white males, well-dressed. If I was talking, I'd be wearing a jacket and a tie, and so would the quiet, obedient white males in the audience who would constitute the audience, and there wouldn't be many people because it was it's only in the late 60s that the place became alive. Now if you walk through the halls or you look around the room, it's half women, third minorities, people casually dressed, which is not just some meaningless. If that's your if that's the way you behave day to day, it has to do with relations among people. These are all changes, and they did not come by a gift. Nor did they come by going to one demonstration, and if it didn't work, going home, or voting once and saying, well, it didn't work, so I'm quitting. It came by the only method there is to bring about change, hard, dedicated, committed work, expecting failures and regression and some successes, and over time, considerable achievements. But it doesn't happen by itself. Take the cause that was dearest to Edward's heart, Palestine. That's considered here to be a very hard top task to work on, very hard commitment. And in some ways that's correct, and in other ways it isn't. In other ways it's a reflection of the same unwillingness to dedicate oneself to a fraction of the effort that people carry out under far harsher conditions everywhere here too. So for example, about last year, you'll recall there was some talk about something called the Saudi plan, a plan for a political settlement of the conflict involving full mutual recognition on the international border, some mutual adjustments and so on. And that was considered a great innovation. In fact, it was just another reiteration of proposals that have been around, including another Saudi plan 20 years earlier, had been around since the mid-1970s, supported by essentially the entire world, including the leading Arab states and the PLO. People here, there was a poll right after the Saudi plan came out, a poll in the United States, asking people what they thought of it. A large majority of the population were first in favor of the plan, and secondly, in favor of urging the U.S. government to engage itself more in the peace process. Now, the people who answered that question that way, the majority, didn't know that those two positions are contradictory. It's precisely because the U.S. government has been extensively engaged in the peace process that neither that plan or any of its predecessors nor its successors has had a chance of success, because the U.S. has been unilaterally blocking efforts at diplomatic settlement, going, in fact, back to 1971, and dramatically so since the mid-1970s, and continues to today. Well, that tells you that there are real opportunities. I mean, the majority of the population already agrees with that kind of solution. It does not know why it is being impeded, but that just means there's something to do, not demonstrations, not resistance, not going to jail, just education. And we can hardly claim that the means are not available to us, that we don't have the means available, say, to landless workers in Brazil or Kurdish human rights activists in Diyarbakir. That's not even, doesn't rise to the level of a joke. Of course, we have the means. What's required is the will. And there are many other indications of the same thing. At the same time, a study came out by the leading polling institution in the world, the program, International Policy Attitudes, asking people in the United States about their attitudes towards the Israel-Palestine conflict, and they asked lots of questions, and the results are very enlightening, which I presume is why it was never published. Turns out that a considerable majority of the population thought that the U.S. ought to cut off aid, all aid, from either of the two parties that is not willing to negotiate in good faith for some kind of two-state settlement. Well, you can figure out what the implications of that are. Second question was, suppose both parties are negotiating. In that case, same large majority thought the U.S. should equalize aid to the two sides. Let me figure out what that means. Again, that suggests plenty of opportunities for creating a large-scale, effective, popular movement, which can have the same kinds of impact here that similar ones have had in many other cases. But again, these things don't happen by themselves. They require engagement, commitment, day by day, on, and ultimately change takes place. As for will, which is what lies at the heart of it, there could not be a better model than Edward left for us as a legacy.
The passing of Edward Said saddens millions of people around the globe. As you know, his voice articulated the aspirations of the disenfranchised, the oppressed, the marginalized, and the voiceless. Edward was a friend, a colleague, and a compatriot. I met him shortly after the June 1967 war, when Arab-American intellectuals had just established a forum from which to address American society and try to respond to the distortions of Arab culture and the Arab case vis-à-vis Israel. His first article on the US media and the 1967 war was appropriately titled "The Arab Portrayed." It was sort of a prelude to his Orientalism. At that time, I don't think that the term was really known since he coined it. But that article attracted my attention and Elaine's attention and the attention of Ibrahim Abulod and others who were founders and who came a little bit after the finding of the Association of Arab American University Graduates, Incorporated. The article represented an indictment of Zionist propaganda, which depicted Arabs as aggressive and irrational, and at the same time it was an implicit call for action. Arab Americans were missing the opportunity to articulate their case with clarity and rigorous scholarly analysis. We had just established the Association of Arab American, etc., AAUG, let's call it for short, to promote the objectives which coincided with the message in Edward's article, The Arab Portrait. Thus, the AAUG discovered Edward Said, and he, Edward, discovered the AAUG. In 1971, he and I were elected to lead the AAUG for that year, for the following year, 1971. Even though Edward did not enjoy administrative details, he did not really like administrative detail at all, he and I met in New York to plan our strategy, as you know the administration should do beforehand. And it was one day prior to his wedding to Maryam. I thought a remarkable testimony to Edward's dedication. It was nearly 8 o'clock when we finished, and he had to drive me to LaGuardia so I can get back to Massachusetts. One of Edward's former students, Frank Motley, who is an associate dean at Iowa University School of Law, described Edward quite accurately as follows. He said, "I suspect that Mozart had the same kind of intelligence, gift, and passion as Edward." End quote, the end of quote. When a friend by the name of Eric Martin read this comparison with Mozart that I wrote in a previous tribute that was mailed out, he wrote me the following. He said, "I too suspect that Said had the same intelligence, gift, and passion as Mozart, but I am certain he had the moral courage of Beethoven." And I don't have time to tell the rest of the story about Beethoven. But Edward certainly had Gramsci's pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. In addition to Edward Said, the world-renowned scholar, there was also Edward, the enthusiastic activist. Scholar-activist is indeed a rare hyphenated description for most people of Said's stature. Although Edward's mannerism, his appearance, lifestyle were seemingly aristocratic, his writings, lectures, and activism consolidated an integral relationship between the academy and civil society. Edward was the scholar activist par excellence, I think. He bridged the gap between the underprivileged and the ivory tower. He took up the cause of Palestine in venues that are likely to be closed to the underprivileged. He took up the cause of Palestine to the lectures, theaters, to the concert stage, to the highbrow journals, to the principal television shows that he appeared on before 1993, because after 1993 he did not even want to do that. He took it to the numerous occasions honoring Edward and celebrating his work worldwide. What I mean to say is that he really allowed Palestine to ride on his coattails rather than the other way around. He did not detach himself from the politics of Palestine, which required travel to distant and sometimes not easily accessible places, sleeping in starless hotels, putting up with mundane and sometimes intolerably sectarian discussions, some of them not really very pleasant or stimulating intellectually. But I mean, that's the nature of a lot of politics. I don't mean to pounce on the politics of Palestine here. Edward was typically described as the conscience of Palestine, having delivered the kind of eloquent message perhaps unheard since that of the late Fayez Sayed. Like Fayez Sayed, he was also an independent who lent his name to Palestine, the idea, the nation, the identity, not to the front or the tanzim, the organizations. Referring to some Palestinian intellectuals, people who headed the NGOs, he once told me, he said, "We don't have to have shops." In the Palestinian lingo, a dukkan is a shop. It's where somebody has his own NGO or a dukkan. He said, "We don't have to have dakakin, Naseer. We're independent." Those who described Edward in the 1980s as Arafat's spokesman in New York forgot to add that Edward has never been a mouthpiece for anybody, nor was he a speechwriter for Arafat when he wrote his famous gun and olive branch General Assembly speech in 1974, and when he drafted the Palestinian Declaration of Independence in Algiers in 1988, in which the Palestinians recognized Israel, and we were supposed to see the start of a settlement based on mutual recognition. These were Palestinian documents reflecting the spirit of the age. When Arafat abandoned the Palestinian consensus, opting for the open-ended Oslo agreement, Edward could not tolerate that new law in the escalating record of Palestinian concessions. His sharp criticism spared neither Arafat nor his associates, whom he publicly named as complicit. I will never forget when Edward referred to these Palestinian intellectuals and luminaries by name at a panel we shared together during the mid-90s in Washington. On that occasion, Edward's rebuke of Arafat's pandering to Washington included certain words which elicited a shy smile from Edward's daughter, Najla, whom I was looking at as we were sitting on the platform there, as well as a disclaimer from the president of the Arab American organization that was sponsoring the event. Edward's statement was, I'm not going to tell you exactly what he said, but he said, even Adid of Somalia told Clinton, you know what to do with himself. The break with Arafat, that's why the shy smile from poor Najla. The break with Arafat resulted in the banning of Edward's books in Arafat's domain, which happens to be also Edward's native homeland. It is rather ironical that Edward's battle against leukemia and what some might describe as the cancer of Oslo began around the same time. In the context of both disasters, Edward invited a group of us, to be exact, 24 of us, in order to deal with the inevitable question that used to come to us many times, and that is, what is to be done? So there was always a what is to be done session that Edward or somebody, but more frequently Edward would call for. So when the going would go rough, we would meet. Edward summoned us to London in October 1991. Sadly, he received the ominous news of his leukemia during that very session, so exactly 13 years ago this month. He invited these Palestinians from 4 continents to put our heads together in order to shoulder the burden of facing yet another challenge. The meeting reminded me of the establishment of the AAUG almost a quarter of a century earlier, except this was an attempt to coordinate informational efforts across continents and not only in the USA. At the opening session on September 6, on September 6, 1991, Edward outlined the goals of the meeting and said in essence that we are not here really to influence the peace process or what they call, peace process, but we are here to coordinate activities, to get to know each other. After all, there are people here who live in 4 continents, 24 of them. They ought to know what they are doing. We ought to really make a difference. We ought to see if a collective will can be put together here to delegitimize the occupation. At that meeting, a speaker from the African National Congress, invited by Edward, helped set the tone for our discussion. He said, the South African leader, when we began to relate to the diplomatic dimension of our struggle in 1989, because the world was changing and insisting on peaceful resolution, we, South Africans, he said, we did not abandon the struggle, we did not abandon the people. The message was clear that our leadership perhaps abandoned. The message was clear. You do not sign away your national rights when you sign an agreement at the White House Rose Garden. Whatever Edward and we said in the next several months fell on deaf ears. No longer was Arafat willing to listen to Edward's advice. After all, Arafat's appearance at the White House in September 1993, September 13th, itself was an act of surrender. It was misconstrued by Arafat as he has perhaps arrived at the White House with his friend Clinton. There was no longer a need for principled interlocutors such as Edward Said. The Palestinian leadership was embracing its own brand of autocracy as the Oslo Agreement was examined by less than half a dozen Arafat-trusted Palestinians. Shortly afterward, Edward's worst suspicions were confirmed. Oslo was a diplomatic umbrella, a mere diplomatic cover for additional Israeli territorial expansionism under presumed peaceful conditions. Yet with the realization of the death of the two-state solution, Edward began to realize the fact that Oslo's architects may have inadvertently set the stage for a single non-sectarian state in all of Palestine. From that moment onward, Edward became a principal voice for a pluralist existence in historic Palestine. Such a vision can derive only from a long-term common Jewish-Arab struggle for equality expressed with a single secular democratic within a single secular democratic republic. In that regard, Edward wrote a great deal actually about it, but here is a quotation, a short quotation from something he wrote in the Christian Science Monitor dated May 27th, 1997. And Edward said, "The whole idea of trying to produce two states is at an end. The Oslo peace process is really in tatters. The lives of Israelis and Palestinians are hopelessly intertwined. There is no way to separate them, and you can have fantasy and denial or put people in ghettos. But in reality, there is a common history. So we have to find a way to live together. It may take 50 years, but the Israeli experience will gradually turn back towards the world they really live in the Islamic Arab world, and that can only come through the Palestinians." The end of quote. So no matter by what name one refers to the future modality for rearranging Palestine, a binational state, a federal system, a state on the Swiss model, the common denominator for Edward must be equal rights, equal citizenship, and a common humanity in which the very concept of citizenship and identity would be transformed. Such a state was based also on Edward's concept of identity, which I think is a very original and exciting concept. His definition of the term Palestinian, the issue of identity, was anyone who identifies with the suffering of the Palestinians. In other words, one does not really have to be ethnically belonging to Palestine. One does not have to have Palestinian blood going through his veins, but someone who identifies with the suffering, who resists the constraints of what Oslo's final status settlement really meant. Isn't that really interesting that somebody who did not like the idea, that invention, that diplomatic facade of the final status, that would be a Palestinian. And finally, someone who participates in the liberation struggle, with liberation being a wide concept, not necessarily armed struggle, which I think Edward, in the beginning of his career towards the late 1960s was not terribly impressed with. Edward will be sorely missed, of course, by numerous colleagues, by many students, by many people, by many intellectuals, by the common people, people who already feel a suffocating void in his untimely absence. Undoubtedly, many will not be able to imagine the world without him, and yet their most eloquent tribute to him is to shun despair and renew their resolve to keep his message alive. Perhaps the best way, in conclusion, to honor Edward's legacy is to work as diligently as he did in the defense of justice and freedom, and to resolve not to be intimidated by the vulgar pressures, by the stereotyping, by the attempts to silence our voices. Since he became inflicted with this horrible disease 12 years ago, he never let it deter him from writing, from traveling, and from contributing. Edward's life would have been easier had he chosen to be a detached intellectual, not having to endure the threats on his life and the vicious attacks on his character. Those attacks were, in a sense, a tribute to his humanity, to his valor, and to his perseverance. The ideals and principles he so ably articulated will surely live on and be a source of inspiration for all in our day and for generations to come. Thank you.